When Mark Carney signed the order to retaliate against U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs with a 50% duty, he didn't just launch a trade war, he struck at the lifeblood of North America's supply chain. From factories in Detroit to canning lines in British Columbia, the shock began to ripple outward. This was no longer a question about the price of steel. It was a matter of survival, about power, carbon data, and the future of the continent's economy. The iron wall of tariffs. When metal becomes a political weapon, each ton of steel is no longer a unit of production, but a declaration of power. In the summer of 2025, Canada no longer played the silent elder brother in North American trade relations. They struck back. And that blow, a 50% tariff, shattered every outdated assumption that allies don't punish each other. In Ottawa's political arena, once accustomed to measured steps, this decision marked a historic pivot. It wasn't just a protest against an economic decree from Washington, but a shift in strategic thinking, from defense to active confrontation. The tariff Canada introduced wasn't impulsive. It was the result of months of endurance as Canadian metal plants struggled to compete, as production costs soared due to decisions made by a president across the border, and as faith in free trade agreements eroded day by day under the name Section 232. Since President Trump reignited steel and aluminum tariffs under the guise of national security, targeting imports from Canada, public opinion in both countries has been divided. But what happened on paper was just the surface. The reality in industrial zones, from Hamilton, Ontario, to auto plants in Windsor, painted a scene no report could fully capture. Slowed down assembly lines, delayed orders, reduced worker shifts, and raw material costs skyrocketing to levels small businesses couldn't survive. It was in that context that the retaliatory decision was signed, not with anger, but with the cold precision of someone who once governed the Bank of England, Mark Carney. For him, this wasn't an emotional war. It was a measured response, calculated down to each carbon unit, each furnace certificate, every data sheet tracing the origin of steel billets. Canada didn't aim to hurt the U.S. They aimed to make clear, if Washington's justification is security, then Ottawa has every right to defend its own industrial foundation. What's worth noting, this counterstrike didn't stand alone. It came with an entire support system for the domestic metal sector, from zero-interest loans to a CAD $4.8 billion fund invested in clean steel technologies. Carney wasn't just building a barrier, he was laying new foundations. An ecosystem Canada could actively sustain if the cross-border supply chain collapsed. This was strategic defensive preparation, but also a message. Canada can stand on its own. The impact of the 50% tariff wasn't just in pricing. It shook the entire trust in the stability of North America's free trade zone. For the first time since NAFTA, and later USMCA, businesses on both sides of the border had to ask, could today's partner become tomorrow's knife holder? This was a psychological blow more dangerous than any percentage. When trust wavers, investment hesitates. And when major investors pull back, every stimulus package becomes nothing more than an umbrella in a political storm. Perhaps that's why international observers, from Tokyo to Brussels, paid special attention. They weren't just watching a clash between two allies. They were evaluating whether the Western alliance model could still be sustainable if every country is willing to strike for short-term gains. In this game, Canada chose to draw its sword first, not to win by force, but to make Washington confront a reality. No one stands outside the rules without paying a price. And so, the story is no longer about steel tariffs, but about the future of an economic order that the U.S. itself helped create. If they are the ones to break it, the next question becomes, who will take the lead? And will Canada still want to walk that path beside them? Data, carbon, and the counterstrike of the century. If the 50% tariff was the first punch, then what Ottawa prepared next was a sophisticated suit of armor, not made of steel, but of data, science, and climate ethics. This was no longer a battle over tariff figures, but a reshaping of the entire language of international trade. Who is cleaner? Who truly bears environmental responsibility? And who is merely disguising protectionism under the banner of national security? Mark Carney, with the mindset of a central banker and a public policy strategist, understood one thing clearly. You can't beat the U.S. by shouting louder, but you can win by proving that Canada is more transparent, more precise, and more ethical, down to every molecule of emission from a steel furnace. And so, within 48 hours of a closed-door cabinet meeting in late June, he instructed the entire national industrial technical system to provide a type of data never before brought to the negotiating table. Furnace locations, billet types used, power source for heating, and isotopic carbon traces. In an era where carbon is becoming political currency, Carney chose precisely what the U.S. didn't want to talk about: their climate footprint. The molten steel running through Pennsylvania furnaces might build tanks, but it emits twice as much as the same process in Quebec, powered by clean hydropower. When he declared, "If the U.S. invokes national security, we will invoke planetary survival," it wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a moral, preemptive strike. Canada's strategy became clear: multi-layered retaliation. Not just increased tariffs, but parallel deployment of green industry support packages. 4.8 billion Canadian dollars from the Green Steel Accord Fund, an alliance between the government and major private firms like ArcelorMittal, Rio Tinto, and Alouette. These public funds weren't scattered as damage control, but invested strategically, converting traditional furnaces to electric arc furnace (EAF) technology, piloting hydrogen-based direct reduced iron (HDRI), and developing inert anode, a smelting process for aluminum with no emissions. And here, Carney proved himself not only a macro-level coordinator, but a future architect. By prioritizing investment in clean aluminum technology in Quebec, he wasn't just saving the metals sector. He was preserving the entire ecosystem of supporting industries, from U.S. breweries relying on clean aluminum to qualify for Inflation Reduction Act (IRA) tax credits, to companies like Tesla needing low-carbon aluminum to back up their green commitments to shareholders and capital markets. Canada, long seen as a silent supplier of raw materials, now rises as the setter of standards. They're not cutting off supply, but asking, "Do you deserve it?" This is a reversal of soft power, a new form of clean tech diplomacy, where the country that controls clean production processes has the decisive voice in global supply chains. And in that race, Canada is one step ahead of the U.S. However, the game isn't just unfolding on the metallurgical floor, but also in WTO negotiation rooms. While Carney urged the Ministry of Justice to prepare a case against the U.S. at the Dispute Settlement Unit, DSU, he also unveiled a flexible tariff ladder. The 50% tariff would gradually decline each quarter if Washington reduced its Section 232 tariffs. This was a strategy of retaining leverage while signaling goodwill, firm enough to apply pressure, but soft enough to offer the opponent an honorable exit. That policy has been compared to the art of re-steering in international trade, not cornering the U.S., but forcing them to self-reflect, that a once trusted neighbor now has the capability and resolve to redefine the rules. Canada is no longer the follower accepting others' standards. They are writing the new ones, through carbon, through data, and through green investment. What's notable is that while the White House dismissed this as a technocratic financial game, conservative senators in Congress began warning, if Canada succeeds, Japan and South Korea will follow. And so, Carney's counterstrike isn't aimed at one decree. It targets the entire trade architecture of the Trump era. A strike that's not loud, but deep and enduring. When the supply chain becomes a crack in the map of allies. There are moments when a political decision that seems symbolic seeps deeply into every production line, every worker's payroll, every truck carrying parts across the border. The 50% tariff that Canada imposed on U.S. steel and aluminum was not just a line of trade law. It was a catalyst that made visible what the two North American economies had long avoided admitting. Their supply chain was no longer invisible or seamless, but fragile, fragmented, and politically risky. Less than 2 weeks after Carney signed the tariff order, tension signals began to surface, not at the top of diplomatic towers, but in industrial zones where contracts were delayed, orders returned, and cost spreadsheets started turning red. In Alberta, a pipeline project was suddenly halted due to steel pipe imports from the U.S. becoming over 30% more expensive. In Ontario, a major automotive chassis manufacturer, which had operated in sync with GM's plants in Detroit, had to cut back from 3 shifts to 2, and may soon be down to just 1. The impact didn't come from Canada targeting U.S. steel, but from the fact that both sides had staked their entire production model on the seamless interlinking of cross-border components. The Ambassador Bridge doesn't just carry goods, it carries the heartbeat of North America's heavy industry. And now, each shipment crossing from Windsor to Detroit carries not just bolts and axles, but anxiety. Will it still run next week? An internal Ford report showed that the increased cost of importing thick steel plates from Canada alone cut profit margins on each SUV made in Michigan by more than $320. Over a vehicle model's life cycle, that's about $45 million in lost profits, not to mention the ripple effects of reduced R&D budgets, delayed EV projects, and trimmed hours at supporting factories. But what worries Detroit's CEOs isn't just the number. It's the unpredictability. When the U.S. government imposes steel tariffs citing preventing Chinese steel masquerading as Canadian, and Canada responds by returning to American consumers a carbon math problem, the supply chain ceases to be an economic system and becomes a hostage in an ideological war. That's why concerns started spreading even to places seemingly on the sidelines. Craft breweries in Vermont, dependent on aluminum from Quebec for cans, began to see prices rise by the cent. A few small businesses even considered switching to glass bottles, despite higher shipping costs, just to escape a can war they never joined. Meanwhile, Tesla, planning to use clean Canadian aluminum at its Berlin plant, now faces the risk of reverting to Southeast Asian suppliers, bringing with it a host of carbon, tax credit, and brand image complications. From there, the North American supply chain, once praised as a model of efficient production integration, is becoming a discordant portrait. Each country starts pulling back its own role, creating invisible cuts across the global production map. Worse, this happens at a time when automation, artificial intelligence, and green transition demand coordination, not division. Mark Carney, in a brief speech at the G7 summit, called this phenomenon a cold disintegration. Nations not withdrawing troops, not declaring war, but quietly backing away from integration commitments through tariffs and technical clauses. And according to him, if no correction is made, this disintegration will not only break the flow of goods, but also shatter faith in the sustainability of modern trade. It's no surprise that major banks like Morgan Stanley and RBC have begun adjusting their supply chain risk models. Because if a steel supply contract can be blown away by a single tweet or executive order, then trade stability has become the most fragile concept in an era of polarized geopolitics. And so, the supply chain, once a symbol of North American cooperation, is now a battlefield where every inch of steel, every carbon dollar, and every executive decision can disrupt a machine once thought untouchable. This is no longer a matter of production, but a test of trust. When prices become political statements. At a time when politicians declare they are protecting domestic production with tariff barriers, it is the consumers who end up paying the price, down to the last cent. The steel-aluminum tariff war between the United States and Canada has gone beyond the boundaries of a typical trade dispute, turning each can of beer, each pickup truck, each aluminum extrusion into living proof of a symbolic confrontation stretching from the London Metal Exchange to small suburban supermarkets. Within just 1 week of Canada announcing its 50% retaliatory tariff, the global metals market began to react in a domino effect. Cold-rolled steel futures on the London Metal Exchange, LME, surged by $60 per ton. 3-month aluminum futures exceeded $2,540 per ton, the highest in 8 months. Analysts at Morgan Stanley described it as a sudden return of supply security concerns, not due to immediate shortages, but because companies began doubting the reliability of global logistics networks. The paradox is this: Canada, a country with relatively small global output, holds in its hands an invisible but powerful weapon: low carbon intensity in metal production. That alone has forced many major U.S. corporations, heavily reliant on maintaining strong ESG ratings, to access cheap credit and sustainable investors, to nervously re-examine their balance sheets. If aluminum from Quebec is cut off, they don't just lose a supplier, they lose a key link to their green business image, which helped anchor them in the new investment wave. Tesla is a clear example. Its production lines in Nevada and Berlin had planned to use aluminum from Canada to meet EU carbon standards. Now, if forced to switch to imports from Indonesia or the Gulf, where most aluminum is coal-based, they could lose access to green financing, meaning financial costs would skyrocket, directly affecting profits and stock valuation. In a world where each percentage of emissions can be translated into money, Carney struck exactly at the pressure point that tariff walls cannot protect: reputation. It didn't stop there. The price war crept into even the smallest corners of the economy. The Beer Canada Association warned every cent increase in aluminum prices could push craft brewers off store shelves, where every centimeter is a battle for survival. With profit margins already razor-thin, a 5-cent increase per can due to packaging could mean the difference between surviving and going bankrupt. At supermarkets in Toronto or Montreal, consumers are beginning to see local brands slowly disappear, replaced by foreign products made with cheaper but lower-quality aluminum, with a more visible carbon footprint. In that context, Canadian policymakers had to urgently propose measures to buffer the price shock. Backroom negotiations with large corporations like Coca-Cola, Molson, and Danone were revealed. The government would consider partial tax exemptions if companies maintained import volumes according to historical quotas, a face-saving mechanism to avoid widespread inflation while keeping leverage over Washington. This is modern politics, negotiating the price of each beverage can to maintain strategic pressure. Still, one cannot deny, citizens of both countries are the direct victims. In Michigan, where large pickup trucks are produced, the average cost per vehicle has increased by nearly $850 Canadian dollars, as components imported from Ontario were hit with reciprocal tariffs. In Vancouver, real estate developers have had to recalculate entire building designs due to shaped steel prices rising over 15%, affecting project timelines. It's the inevitable cost of a war where no matter who wins, the people still pay with their cost of living. Carney knows this well, but instead of dodging the issue, he chose to price politics transparently. The tariff announcement came with a graph showing the schedule: high at first, gradually reduced quarterly if the U.S. de-escalated, not just as a market signal, but as a message to both Wall Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. Canada doesn't want to escalate, but is ready to pay the price to defend fairness. And if necessary, they will turn every price increase into a challenge against the logic of their opponent's policy. When prices become vehicles of political messaging, every card swipe, every raw material order, every distribution contract becomes an unofficial referendum. In this chess match, Canada isn't playing with weapons, but with invoices. And in an era where economics are tightly intertwined with social perception, that may be the most dangerous strike of all: the tariff ladder and the two-way game. In political economic confrontations, victory isn't about the applause at the beginning, but about who still has a seat when the dust settles. Mark Carney understands that, and instead of pushing Washington into a corner, he chose to build an exit. But not just an exit for the U.S., an exit for both sides. A path designed with data, trust, and political transparency. They call it the Tariff Ladder. Amid rising tensions, as inflation indicators began casting shadows over consumer confidence, Ottawa didn't fire another shot, but released a slim 3-page document that hit like a disarmament map. In it, the 50% tariff was not permanent, but the starting point of a conditional downward sequence. Each quarter, if Washington gradually reduced metal tariffs under Section 232, then Canada would reduce accordingly. A policy that seems simple, but in reality is a powerful psychological weapon. Because at that moment, Carney wasn't just negotiating with the White House, he was negotiating with CEOs, lobbying groups, and citizens paying more each day. He knew no politician dares to retreat if only pressured. But if they're given a way to back out with dignity while keeping the national interest defender mask intact, the game might end in a draw. That's not weakness. It's a strategy of soft overcoming hard, using long-term structure to defuse short-term conflict. The tariff ladder also helped Ottawa restore the image of a responsible country in the global trade system, something especially important in a time when the WTO is paralyzed by an appellate mechanism crisis. When Canada clearly announced its conditions for reducing tariffs, it indirectly sent a message to other partners. We're not acting on a whim, we have reasons, and those reasons can be defended before any international legal body. At the same time, Canada's Ministry of Justice quietly finalized a case to file with the WTO's Dispute Settlement Unit, DSU. In it, Ottawa accused the U.S. of abusing Section 232, a mechanism originally designed to handle military threats, not protect domestic industry. Though Carney was fully aware, with Washington still blocking WTO judge appointments, the chance of the case being processed in the next few years is close to zero. But what he wanted wasn't a courtroom win. It was a public opinion win. Because once the file is submitted, Canada can cite international procedure to legitimize its actions. No longer just an emotional retaliation, but a response with grounds, oversight mechanisms, and accountability. While the U.S. side continues to emphasize national security as an absolute umbrella, Carney chose transparency as his rain shield. And this strategy wasn't only supported by Canadian citizens. According to the latest Abacus data poll, 61% of nationwide voters and 68% in Ontario's industrial belt agreed with the conditional retaliation stance. Notably, even conservative voter groups, who typically oppose government intervention, said Canada should respond proportionally but within limits. That shows the tariff ladder isn't just a diplomatic tool, but also a social stabilizer in times of upheaval. Inside Parliament, Carney also succeeded in building a temporary bipartisan coalition, though Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre criticized him for retaliating with the same behavior we condemn. MPs from the Bloc Québécois and the NDP stood behind him, for one simple reason. If no action was taken, Canada's metallurgy sector would be swept away by costs, and workers would be the first to lose. The carrot-and-stick strategy, high tariffs but conditionally declining, is also being closely observed by other countries. In Tokyo, Seoul, Brussels, trade analysts are starting to view Canada as a model to counter the U.S.'s unilateral policies. No direct confrontation, no total withdrawal, but a three-lane road, with a counterattack path, a de-escalation lane, and enough room for allies to join if needed. In a crisis, some politicians choose to strike hard to score points. Others choose to endure to maintain stability. But there is a rarer kind, one who dares to design a system where even the opponent sees a way out. Mark Carney is doing just that. Not just for Canada, but potentially for the entire post-globalization trade system. And if his tariff ladder succeeds, it may become the default model for how the future world handles shocks no one wants, but everyone must face. From Ottawa's Parliament to the silent room in Washington. The steel and aluminum war between Canada and the United States, though gunless, is opening two opposing fronts within each country's political sphere. In Ottawa, it is a boisterous forum where parties debate fiercely over the limits of protectionism and national responsibility. In Washington, it's a much quieter room, where no one dares admit that the policy designed to protect American steelworkers may actually be costing them their jobs. Up north, Mark Carney makes no secret that the decision to impose a 50% tariff was a calculated strike to force the White House to face reality. Their economy is no longer as independent as the America First slogan proclaims. But he also knows that for the counterstrike not to become a double-edged sword, he must build a strong enough political foundation. And that's why he played a rare move in Canadian political history. A temporary alliance among ideologically opposed parties. With support from the New Democratic Party, NDP, and the Bloc Québécois, two forces deeply skeptical of the American-style free market model. Carney built a political buffer zone in favor of tough but reasoned action. They weren't just opposing Trump. They were opposing the notion that Canada must always play the quietly enduring partner. And more importantly, they believed it was time for Canada to stop playing the role of compliant trade partner and become a strategic rival of equal weight. But not everyone supports it. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre accused the Prime Minister of sabotaging the beaver economy, an image evoking the hard-working, gentle, and patient spirit of Canadians. In his view, retaliating against the U.S. with tariffs is counterproductive, pushing the domestic economy into an unnecessary confrontation spiral. Yet, polling numbers contradict that view. 61% of national voters and nearly 70% in industrial Ontario affirm their support for the conditional retaliation policy. They aren't choosing anger. They're choosing strategic self-defense. Meanwhile, in Washington, things are more complicated. Outwardly, President Trump remains firm with his old rhetoric. Steel is the backbone of national security. But internally, reports are piling up. 4,200 jobs at risk in Ohio, 3,600 in Pennsylvania if the supply from Canada is disrupted. More concerning, these are two key swing states in the upcoming election, where he previously won thanks to pledges to protect heavy industry. Moreover, industry giants, from Ford to General Motors, have begun to speak up in internal reports. Steel tariffs are eating into profit margins and forcing them to cut back on electric vehicle projects. The protectionist argument is becoming harder to defend, especially as the reality shows. Most of the taxed raw materials aren't from China, but from Canada itself, the closest and oldest ally. Ironically, the steel unions, once staunch Trump backers, are now caught in a dilemma. They're protected by the tariff wall, but watching factories lose orders due to part shortages from Canada. Keeping the tariffs, but losing jobs. That's the paradox no one wants to say out loud, yet everyone is facing. And inside the White House, whispers begin about the political cost of a policy too easy to expand, but too difficult to roll back. Carney didn't wait for the opponent to break the deadlock. He chose to shape international opinion through sideline meetings at the G7, G20, and APEC. In London, he leaked a policy summary of the reverse tariff ladder to the press. In Tokyo, he met privately with Japan's Minister of Industry to explain why, if Canada succeeded, Japan could adopt a similar model. And in Brussels, European negotiators began asking, is this the moment to establish a collective mechanism to counter the abuse of Section 232? The more countries start asking questions, the more pressure mounts on Washington. Not because they're being isolated, but because they're standing on the wrong side of allies who've stood beside them for 70 years. And in a global order, fracturing under populism, Carney seems to be crafting a new version of soft power. No preaching, just showing the world that the rules can be rewritten. By refusing to stay silent. If Ottawa succeeds, they will not only prove the strength of a middle power that knows how to use data, policy, and alliances at the right time. They will also send a clear signal. In this era of chaos, it's not the loudest voice that wins. It's the one that can make the opponent's silence unbearable. When the outsider becomes the beneficiary. In any conflict, there's a loser, a winner, and someone standing outside, harvesting the gains. In the steel-aluminum war between the United States and Canada, the name barely mentioned in early headlines, but prominently present in geopolitical backrooms, is China. International observers have grown accustomed to the West shooting itself in the foot. But this time, the degree of internal division and blindness meant Beijing didn't need to do much. Just wait. Wait for one side to erect tariff walls, the other to retaliate, and both to disrupt supply chains they spent decades building. Meanwhile, Chinese steel trains quietly roll along the Asia-Europe economic belt, through Kazakhstan and into Europe. China's Ministry of Commerce, typically reserved in official statements, suddenly released Q2 data showing steel exports to the Eurasian Economic Union, EEU, rose by 22.6%, a modest figure that hints at much more. Hot-rolled steel volumes shipped via Kazakhstan, then rerouted to Eastern Europe surged, while nations long faithful to North American suppliers began considering shifting supply chains to reduce political risk. China doesn't need to directly intervene in the Canada-US clash. They only need to tune their production rhythm to the instability cycle of the West. When the U.S. clamps down on Canadian steel, Texas mills look elsewhere. When Canada fights back, aluminum prices climb, forcing buyers to seek cheaper sources, regardless of carbon or ethics. And that source, often labeled the steel inflation nation, is still China, with metallurgical capacity the world has never controlled. Mark Carney knew this well. In a cabinet meeting, he bluntly said, "We are punishing each other to create space for a rival that doesn't need permission to seize market share." It's no coincidence that in the retaliation roadmap, he tied trade policy to carbon standards. Because once Canada forces the world to account for emissions footprints, China, relying heavily on coal for its furnaces, will enter the game with much weaker numbers. However, moral weapons aren't enough without allies. That's why Ottawa is proactively sharing low-carbon supply chain data with Japan, South Korea, and European countries, where bilateral trade deals are being renegotiated with stricter climate terms. In this approach, Canada is not just a retaliator. They are a standards pioneer, a rules maker for the post-globalization era. And if those rules gain acceptance, Nations will have tools to jointly challenge the USA's Section 232, criticized for its ambiguity, unilateralism, and susceptibility to abuse. A legal environmental front could form, including Canada, Japan, Germany, France, and even Australia, discussing how to prevent a country from wielding national security as a universal wildcard to sidestep common trade rules. Meanwhile, China is accelerating quietly. No longer explicitly named in this conflict, they've become the default alternative supplier. They approach African and Latin American countries with low prices and streamlined contracts. With each steel shipment, they reinforce their position as the world's ultimate factory, despite Western efforts to reshuffle supply chains. The result? Once again, conflicts among Western allies become launchpads for the very rival they meant to restrain. And as the U.S. pushes Canada away, Canada, in its weakened state, is forced to pursue alternative markets, deepen trade ties with Asia and Europe, and expand green agreements as soft power tools. And China? They just keep producing. While the world debates origins, they're capturing the destination. Carney, during a brief press conference, sighed when a German reporter asked, "Do you think China is winning?" He replied simply, "We aren't letting them win, but we have paved the road ourselves." And that may be the truest description of the metal conflict of 2025, a fight between two allies, yet echoing into places they never expected.